Hello, my name is Sarah Roberts, and welcome to my big book presentation. When I was brainstorming ideas for my big book, I knew that I wanted to create something that was multicultural. Initially, I was going to do a book that was more of a narrative, but I finally decided upon doing something more informational, and I settled on the 7 continents because this was such a versatile subject for this book, and I knew I would be able to incorporate a lot of different ideas, both now and in my future classrooms. So, the first page of the book is Australia, which is continent number 1. And something important to note here is that all of the pictures on this page are removable because they have Velcro on the back of them. So if I was reading this in my classroom, all of these pictures would be removed prior to the beginning of the reading. And then as I was reading, I would invite the students to place the pictures in the correct areas as I was reading information about that continent. So as you can see, in addition to the pictures, there's small text sections of the page. And the first one is just about the continent of Australia. So it has different facts such as the population, how many different languages they speak there, the capital. And then for Australia, of course, it's just one country, but in the other continents, I tell how many countries are in that continent. And on the right here, we can see there's just a example of a text section, and this is not from Australia, this is from North America, as we'll see later on. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what is in each text section, because the text sections aren't just on the continents, they're also on different landmarks and different things to see in that continent. So the next 2 pages are continent number 2, which is Africa. And this was a really fun page to create because Africa has so many different interesting, cool facts about it that I wanted to include. So I included several different landmarks and tourist attractions, including Mount Kilimanjaro, the National Reserve, where many people go on safaris, and then the Giza necropolis, of course, which includes the pyramids and the Great Sphinx of Giza. And as you can see, I also included several animals, and I do this for each continent. I include several native animals as well as native trees to that continent. And continent number 3 is North America, and this is after you flip the page. And this took up 2 pages as well because there was, again, so many different interesting and cool things that I wanted to include. And I think it's really important with North America that we make a distinction with our students that North America is not just the United States. So I tried to include interesting facts about Mexico as well as Canada because I think students can be kind of closed-minded when it comes to North America, and they can forget that it includes other countries, not just the one that we live in. And continent number 4 is Europe. And again, this took up 2 pages because Europe especially is home to so many tourist attractions. So as we can see, I included the Roman Colosseum, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the Westminster Palace, including Big Ben, as well as the Eiffel Tower and the Parthenon, which is in Greece, of course. So again, the text sections all include different interesting facts about each landmark. And just, for example, they would include when it was built, why it was built, how many visitors it receives, and yeah, just interesting facts like that. So as you were reading this, you would it's very flexible with how you want to read the book, which is great because that makes it more flexible between the grades. You would want to read this differently for a preschool class or any elementary class compared to how you would read it for a middle school class. So how you want to read each text section is kind of up to the teacher, but I would start with the text section on the continent itself and then move on to the different landmarks. And continent number 5 is Asia. And as we can see, I again chose to include different landmarks, and Asia especially has so many natural landmarks, such as Mount Fuji and Mount Everest, and then the Great Wall of China, of course, is so popular and so well known. So, as I mentioned before, all of the pictures would be removed from the page prior to the reading. So then as you're reading, you would say, who has a picture of an animal, and then what do we think a panda looks like, or what do we think a leopard looks like. So we would kind of invite the students to think through as the reading is continuing what picture they have, and then help them kind of match that as we're reading about that picture. And then continent number 6 is South America. And as we can see on the right, I included another close-up of a text section. And this is from Europe on the Colosseum. Because again, I wanted you to see what each text section includes. This is, again, just an example. And each one is different. But this is just an example so you can see what types of facts I chose to include. So for South America, of course, I included the Amazon River and rainforest, as well as some native trees and animals. And then the last continent we have here is Antarctica, which of course there wasn't as much to include for this continent, but I think this continent is almost one of the most interesting ones just because it is so unexplored in a way, and of course it's relatively uninhabited. But there are two things that I chose to include, which were Deception Island and Port Lockroy, both of which I think would really interest students. And then we have another close-up on the right here of a text section from Asia, and this is just a text section just on the general continent, and as we can see, I included the population, how many countries, the rivers and mountain ranges, the languages, and then of course the common trees that are native to that country or continent. So there are so many different lessons that you could teach through this big book. The one that I chose to create for this project was a kindergarten lesson on English language arts. And in this lesson, the students are learning and practicing how to clap syllables. So I created syllable cards, each of which have one of the animals from the big book. And then as we can see, they have a number underneath the syllable card, so the students would clap the syllables of that animal and then place a clothespin on the correct number of syllables. And if there were 2 words for the animal, then the students would just clap the syllables of each word and then place 2 clothespins for each one. And this of course would follow direct instruction and guided practice and the reading of the big book. And then as you're reading the big book, you could read it beforehand as well as after, and both would really help students learn how to clap syllables, especially if you pointed out that as you were reading, you pointed out the syllables of each word. So you paused and clapped the syllables with the class for each animal. Some other ideas that I had for this big book were to do research projects. So students could choose a continent, they could choose a landmark, really anything from the big book, and kind of research that subject more and delve deeper into it. And I liked this idea because students could pick something that interests them, because there is so much in the big book. They could really pick something that stood out to them and then excuse me, and really make it their own. So that kind of excited me just because I know how important it is to include student choice in lessons and projects. Another thing I really liked about this big book was how interdisciplinary it is. This was an English language arts lesson, but you could do social studies in terms of history, in terms of Roman history, ancient Greece. There's just so much history included in the continents. Each landmark itself includes so much history. And then you could also do map reading and teach students how to read maps and how to learn about maps through this big book, because of course the continents you could easily teach maps through the continents. And then you could even teach a math lesson with this big book in terms of distance and have students calculating how many miles are between each landmark. There's a lot of distance included between the continents, so you could even teach math through this big book. So it's extremely interdisciplinary. You can teach a science lesson on the trees and animals and how the characteristics of living things differ between continents, and the weather between the continents, you could do a lesson on that. So there really are so many different subjects you could teach through this big book, which makes me personally really excited to use it in my future classrooms. And then, as I mentioned briefly earlier, you could teach this big book in pretty much any grade. And this might seem surprising at first to use this for high school, but again, you could use this for so many different history subjects. In the earlier grades as well, but even in high school, students could pick something from the big book and do a project on that. So it's very interdisciplinary, and it also could be used for pretty much any grade level, depending on how the teacher chooses to teach it. So that makes me, again, really excited in the future. I know that I'll be able to use this for many different purposes, and I really hope that my students like it. So here's the back cover of my big book. I chose to include the flag of the largest country of each continent. Of course, Russia is the largest country in both Asia and Europe, so I also included Ukraine, which is the second largest country in Europe. So this is just my back cover, so that students could see what some different flags look like for each country, from each continent. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.